Tēnā koutou, and thank you very much, Jackie, friend and colleague from years past, for your work. And once again, Mr. Speaker, thank you so much, not only for your trip last year, but also for the ongoing opportunities that you are taking to share the experiences with us all. My name is Sarah Lee. I am from the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and I have the honour and the privilege of working with Mexico every day and every week here as the head of the Latin America and Caribbean team at MFAT. So it's really a real pleasure to have other people talking about my work today. So I'll introduce them to come up to the stage and we'll get cracking on the next panel. First, and unfortunately our Mexican participants are struggling to connect. So it may be a somewhat New Zealand themed discussion, which is a shame, but hopefully we can connect with them at a later stage. But could I please have the Honourable Tim Groser and Anthony Simpson come up and we'll get this started. Let's get the ones that work. That's one. Do you want to test that one, Tim? Yeah. Good. Yeah. Excellent. So the guests we've gathered on this panel, all two of them at the moment, we'll be speaking to the significant work that Aotearoa, New Zealand and Mexico do together on strategic foreign policy issues around the world, often but not always through the multilateral system. And these issues and the work that we do together reflect in many ways our shared values as countries, whether that's our respect for democratic values, human rights, a free and open trading system and others. So to start first with New Zealand views on perhaps a more trade-focused side, Tim, you were deeply involved in discussions between our two countries on trade, both as a very senior diplomat and our former Minister of Trade. What trade policy impulses brought New Zealand and Mexico together during that time, do you think? And also, if you'd like to reflect on your experiences with Mexico as Minister of International Climate Change Negotiations, please feel free also.
Kia ora tātou, buenas tardes. Would I like to reflect on them? You're going to have trouble stopping me, I think. I'd like to sort of frame it within the first. I'm a great believer in putting before an audience your bigger conclusions, your takeaways, and then backtracking to the analysis behind it so you can see where I'm going. But my own strong view is that if you take even the most important single bilateral relationship New Zealand, Aotearoa, has, which is with Australia, actually the really interesting thing and the thing that will attract attention of the most senior ministers and the most senior officials is the broader shared interest in the wider international agenda, be it multilateral or plurilateral. And I don't think these are, in any sense, in opposition to each other. They very much complement each other. And I strongly believe that the New Zealand-Mexico relationship, and I'm just thrilled to be involved in the 50th celebration of it, has been hugely strengthened over recent years by our shared work together in the two areas that I've been involved in, at least. There'll be other areas that I have no experience in. An apology, first of all. Inevitably, I'm going to draw on personal experience, and it'll have all the baggage of my strong views on when multilateralism works and more often seriously underperforms. So the second takeaway, apart from that general point about the work in the broader agenda, reinforcing the bilateral relationship, is that it's possible in a constructive way only when the broad outlook, one could almost use a word that's normally pejorative, ideological, is aligned. I mean, if you're trying to work on a climate change negotiation and you're dealing, as I have, with delegations which are actually trying to screw the negotiation up, it's impossible to do anything other than manage that. And my first experiences with Mexico were anything other than positive. So I was appointed Chief Agriculture Negotiator in 1985, later overall became Chief Negotiator when Richard Nottage was posted to Tokyo. I was dealing with a Mexico that is so different to the Mexico that most of you people will be familiar with now, and I'm sure, Mr. Speaker, you would have felt this very strongly in the delegation you led. Mexico had only joined the GATT, for those of you not familiar with it. The WTO was simply, GATT 201 in 1986, and was still very inward-looking, deeply suspicious of the United States, as I am from time to time, by the way, but we won't go there. I was ambassador to the United States a few years ago, during the Trump era. Perhaps you can understand why I make that statement. And very protectionist. But we worked primarily with Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, and Brazil on the common agricultural agenda. But Mexico, no. We just had to manage Mexico as one of those many delegations that needed to be contained because they were not in favor of the underlying objectives. So fast forward when I go back into multilateralism, I'm dealing with a Mexico, and indeed other countries like Colombia, totally transformed in their outlook, and a fantastic partner. I won't go through my experiences. I mean, I had to go almost immediately to Cancun in 2003 as chairman of another negotiating group that collapsed over agriculture. I was then invited to be the first of the New Zealand ambassadors to chair agriculture. So I worked very productively with them because we had our own sensitivities, but we're trying to move in the same direction. Later on, with respect to TPP and the Pacific Alliance, because of the negotiating history of TPP, we started it with Singapore in early 1999. I brought Alejandro Jara and Ricardo Lagos into it as soon as I could. But the real objective was to get the United States into it. That took another 8 years. And then I started to work with Bruno Ferrari, tragically not in good health today, but the Minister of Commerce of Mexico. I was very close to him. And then later on, Ildefonso Guajardo, his successor, to try and get Mexico into TPP, what became CPTPP, and I also worked with them on the Pacific Alliance. And all I can say is that I developed enormous respect for the quality of Mexican ministers and officials. On climate change, just very briefly to conclude my opening comments, basically the same thing. So I was, to my utter astonishment, appointed Climate Change Minister International, not domestic, by John Key. There's a particular reason which I can never say in public, but I won't go into it. And immediately, I could see that the negotiating strategy for Copenhagen was utterly ill-conceived. There was no possibility of the two most important countries in climate change, China and the United States, signing up to a legally binding top-down giant version of Kyoto. It had been thrown out by the Senate in 1997, 95-0. And I couldn't believe that so many intelligent officials could work out such a ridiculous negotiating scenario. But when, as a result of me being a critic, not in public, but in private meetings, Obama's climate change special envoy, Todd Stern, introduced me to two outstanding Mexicans, Patricia Espinosa, the foreign minister, who later, of course, became executive director of the UNFCCC, and possibly the most effective diplomat I've ever met, Luis Alfonso de Alba, an absolutely brilliant man. I gave him the nickname of Señor No Lo Sé, because he would be constantly hounded by people and he had to push them off to get something done. So he would continue to say, No lo sé, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know. And I found them absolutely outstanding, and I have got nothing other than positive experiences. So all I'm saying is this: when you have broad, I'll use the word again, ideological alignment between countries, even if they have their nuances of difference, a small country like New Zealand, Aotearoa, can work incredibly well with a large, influential country like Mexico.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that. And I'd like just now to be able to welcome our Mexican participants. We have Dr. Roberto Dondisch from the Mexican Council on Foreign Relations, and also Miguel Hijar-Chiapa, who is President of the Australian and New Zealand Studies Association of North America. Thank you both. I'm so pleased that you could be here with us. I'll turn now and finish the New Zealand side, if that's okay, and come to you a little later. Speaking, I guess, of ideological commonalities, and New Zealand and Mexico work very closely together in New York and in Geneva, but can you give us a perspective on how like-minded, to use the name of this panel, how like-minded are we really, and what does that collaboration get for our respective countries? What's the point?
What's the point? Okay, well, kia ora everyone. This has been one of the most enjoyable events I've ever had to prepare for, because the hardest thing for me to do was to weed out the things I wanted to say. I went out to a lot of my colleagues who like me, have worked in multilateral settings, and asked them what they thought the really standout aspects of our relationship with Mexico were. And I got this torrent of ideas and thoughts. But for me, the starting point for me is when I first began my first multilateral posting in New York, one of my colleagues said to me, everything meaningful I've managed to do here in New York, I've done with Mexico. And that's a direct quote. Literally everything that I've done that I'm proud of, that has meaning, that has made some kind of a difference, I have done with Mexico. And that is absolutely the message I got back from all of my colleagues in Geneva, in Vienna, in New York, how they felt about their Mexican colleagues. I mean, there are these amazing names. As Minister Groser mentioned, Ambassador Alba was actually ambassador there while I was there, and he was a rock star. He was absolutely a rock star. But I had so many people say to me, you have to mention this person, and you have to mention this thing that we did together and that thing we did together. But to answer your question, I mean, the word like-mindedness is thrown around a lot. And for those of you who don't work in multilateral forums, or really it's both an adjective and a noun that is used to say people that we can work with, that share similar values to us. And to be frank, I don't think it does justice to the kind of relationship, certainly in New York where I was based, that we had with Mexico, because based on our values, our vision, and our approach, I really don't think we had a more consistently natural and instinctive and practically useful partner than Mexico. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. One is, as Minister Groser mentioned, our values are fundamentally the same, and they underpin our foreign policy. They're motherhood and apple pie principles, but they're ones that we really do knit into everything we do at the UN, and so does Mexico. So we normally find ourselves framing issues in the same way and looking at solutions in a very similar way. We also have a certain degree of independence, which actually is remarkably rare in the UN. And when I say independence, I mean we negotiate as ourselves. We don't belong to a major group that effectively binds our hands in certain settings. So we actually get to speak our mind on a lot of things, and we're not afraid to do that, particularly when those core values that we share are at stake. I think we really value multilateralism. I mean, there is a certain number, as Minister Groser mentioned, there's a certain number of countries that tend to go to multilateral meetings to make sure they don't happen, nothing actually happens, and that there isn't an outcome that means anything. There are some who come in with very particular interests. There is a smaller group in the middle who basically want the system to work. They want the system to deliver and to make the system, deliver for the people of the world. And New Zealand and Mexico are in that group, and we're very prominent members. Another thing that makes us quite, we believe in the rule of law. We believe in international cooperation as the first choice, and multilateral settings as a really important means of solving problems, and we really invest in it. I think the other thing is that we tend to be, and I don't want to sound conceited here, but I do genuinely believe that New Zealand and Mexico have tended to be thought leaders on a lot of issues. We've tended to be first movers to identify an issue, and very influential in framing up how that issue is shaped and seen. And that's incredibly important. When you want to start a multilateral process and a discussion, the starting point is fundamentally important. And there's been so many issues where we have actually come together to basically say, what is the problem? Well, first of all, there is a problem. And secondly, what is it? What is the nature of this problem? And what is it that the international community can do? And those are really important conversations. And we're very, very good at it. We're also very good, I think, at then taking it through the life cycle of a negotiation and of resolving an issue. We know how to build consensus, how to build convergence, both in negotiations, but also the things that happen between and around negotiations, to just sort of start funneling people towards a particular area, to build consensus around the areas where you can actually deliver outcomes, and then bring people together to where you can actually find a landing zone in a negotiation. I think the other thing is that, and this is something I learned from my Mexican colleagues, a lot of people approach multilateral negotiations as debating moots. You go in there and you make the best argument, you come with the best prepared brief, and you win. That's just how it works. What I learned from my Mexican colleagues is you have to be the best prepared person in the room, and Mexicans almost always are thoroughly prepared, incredibly professional and very skilled, but they also understand the human element of it, the need to build trust, the need to try and understand the perspectives of others and why they have the positions that you don't like, and the ability to take that and to turn it into coalitions, that coalitions of interest, but also bring in people from that you don't entirely agree with into your camp where you can build consensus around issues. And the final thing, and I know I'm really indulging you here, is that we really believe we're ambitious for the outcomes. We're not just looking for an outcome for the sake of it. We're looking for outcomes that deliver actual meaningful, impact and results. And I think those things together have made us incredibly, incredibly natural and effective partners.
Great, thank you very much for those perspectives from the front line, as it were, of multilateral negotiations. I'd like now to turn to Dr. Dondisch, if that's okay. And you were Mexico's chief negotiator for 3 landmark agreements: the Paris Climate Change Agreement, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and the Arms Trade Treaty. Quite a diverse range. How did you engage with New Zealand counterparts to, as Anthony described, make it work in those negotiations?
Of course. Well, thank you for the question. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. Happy to represent COMEXI here. And I'm going to take a little bit, and of course, sharing the panel with such amazing people whom I actually have worked with in the past. So I'm so happy to be able to share. And I'm going to take a lot of what Anthony said, because it was a little bit the same to me when they asked me if I was able to do this panel. I said, absolutely. I don't even have to prepare. I know perfectly well what I did with New Zealand every single time, because we were always together. So, I mean, there was at some point that I knew what New Zealand delegate was going to say, and they knew what I was going to say without even asking ourselves. We knew each other that well, and we trusted each other throughout. And even though each of these different processes that we're talking about were quite different, and as I go into the processes, not going to take too much time, but just to add a little bit to what Anthony was saying, I think it's important to understand that both of our countries take very seriously a role nobody gave us, nobody's asking us to do, but a role as bridge countries. Not bridge countries in the sense that people go above us and just go with their interests. No, it's actually, we take it very seriously to bring people together, to bring different groups together. Because we both Mexico and New Zealand have foreign policies which are based on our interests, but in a principled manner. And that's something that it sounds like everybody should have it, but it's not the case. So it's great to have a partner like New Zealand. I mean, from climate change, of course, Tim already talked about a little bit of the amazing job he did in COP16. While Mexico was trying to basically put the rail cars back on the track so we can move forward to what eventually became Paris. And his work was just necessary, complicated, and very, he had to work until the last minute. I was there with Patricia sitting in the back then and hearing it. And it was so important. But as we move forward to Paris, even though each of our countries is in a different negotiating group, it was our links that allowed us to try to get those groups to work together. You see, Mexico was trying to get an agreement that was implementable, an agreement that was that looked at different ways for development, that would change the way countries develop, while at the same time understanding that there are common responsibilities, but there are historical ones. I think New Zealand and Mexico really understood each other, and we could help other countries understand where we were going with. In terms of SDGs, we both wanted a people-centered approach. And we worked together, even though it was a very complicated negotiation, because the climate change negotiation was happening at the same time. So one of the things that New Zealand and Mexico worked together is that some countries actually tried to use the SDG process to get around some previously accepted agreements on environmental issues. We didn't allow them to do that. And we worked together, especially regarding the sea. And I think that was one of the great works that we did. In fact, at some point, even if we didn't have enough delegates, we could share information on what's going in different rooms. That's the trust that we had. And I'm leaving probably the ATT to last because it's probably my best example of an amazing relation between Mexico and New Zealand. And I do have to tip my hat to Ambassador Del Higgy and all the team who did a superb job. And I'm not exaggerating when I'm saying that without Mexico, Norway, and New Zealand working together, the ATT would look very different from what it does. We took it upon ourselves to make sure the treaty was strong, was proactive, was engaging. It was based on human rights and international humanitarian law. And it was difficult. We had to stand a lot of pressure, but we always stand together. And at the end of the day, we were all sitting down at the UN, having finished the work of the day, thinking what was coming about. But having these three countries together made a huge difference. And it was always a pleasure. It was always a pleasure. And I'm going to tell you something. I think one of the secrets is that we're two countries that might not always have the biggest delegation at the UN or other international multilateral fora. But we give a lot of play to our delegates. And our delegates always understand the responsibility they have. That's very common now in the business sector, not in the government sector. So that's, I think, one of the things that it's amazing, and it has helped us to create these relations that allows us to go forward and push the world into a better direction.
Thank you. You'll be pleased to hear that many of those issues were issues we were talking about and discussing with Fernando earlier this year to see where we can take things even further together.
Great.
And Miguel, thank you for your patience. I'm really keen to get your perspectives on a slightly different issue, which is whether and how New Zealand and Mexico can work together to discuss geopolitical issues in our region and beyond.
Kia ora. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here and to take part in this wonderful event commemorating this very special relationship. My perspective is that of a scholar rather than that of a practitioner, unlike my preceding speakers that I'm joining in this panel. So I will speak from a very scholarly perspective about these issues that are really important right now in international relations. I think one of the most preoccupying challenges for both our countries, for Mexico and New Zealand, is the great power rivalry that our region is right now experiencing. The rise of China, of course, has transformed the landscape of the Pacific Rim, of the Indo-Pacific for the past 2 decades, especially. And this has led, of course, to a lot of tensions with the regional hegemon, which is also the global hegemon, the United States. And of course, this has had ramifications in several dimensions, not just in terms of what we may understand as typical security challenges that have to do with military issues, that have to do with defense issues, but also in other realms such as trade, human rights, climate change, and so on. So I think that one of the most preoccupying, one of the most worrying challenges is what are the implications of this rivalry between the United States and China for our countries specifically, but also for the regional order. And I think that Mexico and New Zealand are in a very complicated position because China is a very important trading partner for New Zealand, but at the same time, the United States is an important strategic ally. For Mexico, the most important relationship in both strategic and economic terms is the United States. However, China is also an important economic partner for Mexico. And this, of course, creates problems for both countries in terms of balancing both relationships at a time in which Beijing and Washington are at odds. So, given that middle powers and small powers, such as Mexico and New Zealand, don't have the same leverage when it comes to trying to get great powers to negotiate and talk to each other and engage in fruitful dialogues, what we can do is to try to shape the multilateral fora and, of course, the rules of the game of the region. Both Mexico and New Zealand, as my colleagues here have already said, are like-minded countries that believe in certain principles, that believe in multilateralism, that believe in international cooperation. And these are two countries that are always engaging in very fruitful efforts in the context of the United Nations and other multilateral fora. And therefore, I strongly believe that Mexico and New Zealand can keep pushing for a rules-based order, not just at the global level, not just within the context of the United Nations, but specifically within the Pacific Rim region, within the Indo-Pacific. APEC is a forum in which both Mexico and New Zealand can try to shape this rules-based order in the region. Also, by collaborating within the context of the CPTPP and the Pacific Alliance, Mexico and New Zealand can help to shape the rules of the game when it comes to trade issues, economic issues, especially at a time in which economic nationalism and trade wars seem to be becoming more and more relevant as tools for statecraft for certain countries. But there are also other areas, other dimensions in which both countries can cooperate. I'm thinking of more pressing security issues, such as transnational organized crime. Both New Zealand and Mexico have been very active when it comes to promoting the Palermo protocols that are part of the Palermo Convention against transnational organized crime. I think this is a very relevant topic for both countries in which they can keep pushing forward. Human rights have also been mentioned during this panel, and I think that this is a topic in which both Mexico and New Zealand have played leadership roles. They have taken the lead, especially when it comes, and I think that this is a priority for both countries. At least this is something that both the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the Mexican Secretariat of Foreign Affairs have been very clear about, which is promoting a human rights agenda that addresses issues such as gender, gender-based rights, rights related to sexual orientation. I think these are two topics in which both countries can also provide clear leadership in multilateral fora. And of course, things related to peacekeeping operations. Both Mexico and New Zealand are very, very strongly committed to peacekeeping operations in the context of the United Nations, and naturally, disarmament. And I think that another very important security and geopolitical challenge is definitely climate change, which has also been very relevant to the remarks of my other fellow speakers. And I think that climate change and the Sustainable Development Goals agenda are two areas in which Mexico and New Zealand can work together and build partnerships with other like-minded countries in order to push forward this agenda and contribute to a more secure world, a safer world, and a rules-based order in which all countries can operate and work for a better world and a more peaceful world.
Thank you. I'm running up against the clock, I can see, just against the glare of the lights. But I am going to ask you all to help me a little with my work and to take up the challenge that Fernando set us earlier in this session to talk about how do we bring our relationship now into a new era. So if I could get you all to just say one thing that you think we should do that is new or different or would really challenge the way that we have traditionally worked together. Ant, are you willing to go first?
I am, and I'm going to throw your question back at you because it ain't broke. In terms of our cooperation in the multilateral system, what we need to do next is move on to the next key issue that requires friends of the system to get behind it and to solve problems. There's a whole host of things, whole host of international instruments that might not exist or would almost certainly not exist in their current form if it hadn't been for cooperation between New Zealand and Mexico. Anything from the recent Marine Biodiversity Treaty to the Disabilities Human Rights Treaty. We played a role, nuclear disarmament, we haven't even talked about the ATT Treaty. We just need to keep doing that. We just need to keep working together. Maybe one thing I think we could do is perhaps structure and institutionalize that cooperation and that dialogue a bit more, and perhaps even have a regular process for consulting before certain meetings and making sure that we are more consciously doing it. We haven't needed to up until now because it just has organically happened, but that's probably the one thing I can think. But otherwise, just keep on keeping on because I think it's one of the great success stories.
Tim, would you have a challenge for me and my team?
Well, I think my views are really very aligned with your comments. The cooperation is working extremely well. I don't think we should be looking for any new departments at all. What I would say is simply that the next generation of Mexican and New Zealand senior officials, negotiators, ministers should just focus on what works. And there are two fundamental things that I have in my mind just reflecting on this discussion. One, of course, is your original point about the power of ideas. And when you made that, I was thinking about that famous French phrase, la puissance d'une idée en marche, the power of an idea on the move. But it can't just be an abstract idea. And for a small country to come up with an idea that simply is made to measure for our needs, you might as well not bother. An idea will work only if it's finally backed by real power, which New Zealand doesn't have. So the lesson here is, albeit Mexico does have a lot more power as the 11th or 12th largest economy in the world and a population of 112 million or whatever it currently is, but it nevertheless still will lack the might of a superpower. So we will work together, I think, most effectively when we remember those two lessons. An idea that simply suits the Mexican agenda or the New Zealand agenda will go nowhere, and we have to find the big dog in the room. It will vary according to the theatre of diplomacy that we're talking about. The big dog in the Pacific Alliance is Mexico itself, but when we're talking in global security terms, it's not. So I think as long as those central ideas and principles are kept in mind, I think we should continue to do what we're doing and not try to pretend that there is some alternative out there.
Great, thanks. Really quickly, because our Zoom participants can't see the signs that I'm getting held up to me, a quick idea from you both. Dr. Dondisch, perhaps you first.
Sure, I'm going to go quickly. There's so many things to do. But first of all, I would say three things. One, there are areas where we haven't worked as closely, not because we can't, it's just we haven't, and that we can certainly do. And that's, as we go into an international transition into a new system or not, we have to see how it comes. There is a role for countries like New Zealand, like Mexico, to play in making sure that our views, our ethical standings, our principal intentions are always taken into consideration and are not lost in this transition. That's a huge issue, and it requires to raise our voice. Lastly, really fast, Arms Trade Treaty. We need to make sure it's implementable. We need to make sure it works well. There's a lot of work still to be done. So I'm working with the Simpson Center on that issue, but we have to push forward. Again, thank you for the invitation.
Miguel, last word, quick last word.
Well, I think that Mexico and New Zealand should keep collaborating and building coalitions of like-minded countries that keep pushing forward in certain fora, certain agendas. And of course, I think that one important agenda that New Zealand has been leading for the past few years that Mexico could definitely join is the Christchurch Call. I think that Mexico could also play a very important and constructive role there. So I think that is one area in which both our countries can cooperate.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your perspectives. That will help me frame up my work agenda for the rest of the year. And I understand that it is now time for a cup of tea. Is that correct? Back at 5:10, please. Back at 5:10, please. Thank you all for listening.